what I want to do, I'm at good evening. I want to thank everybody for coming back this evening. We had a great session this morning. I think everybody felt kind of pumped up, focused. Tonight is sort of like a continuation of the conversation we started this morning. And the topic of tonight's town hall is organizing through the storm. Fine, somebody's getting fined. I don't know who. Somebody's getting lifted for 50 bucks. But anyway, The topic tonight is organizing through the storm. The idea behind that is this. Most of us are engaged in some form of ongoing work in our unions, in our communities, in coalitions, and that work is premised on ongoing effort. You have meetings, you have schedules, you plan activities, and then you go home, you cut on the television, another black person has been done wrong for being black. And then there's a hashtag movement. And then people saying, we got to get together and meet, got to talk, got to do something. Well, how do we deal with juggling those kinds of priorities? How do you organize through the storm? How do we deal with a person who just by a tweet can change your day? So part of what we want to do tonight is talk about some of the issues that we deal with in our ongoing work and how we can develop some type of response to staying on point, but at the same time, staying in the flow. Staying on point and staying in the flow. That's what we have to try to juggle. So tonight we have 4 panelists who have done work or doing work in their respective organizations, and they're going to share with us their views on some issues, some strategies, some tactics, and some lessons they've learned along the road of organizing. First, let me introduce one of our panelists. His name is Hector Sanchez. Hector is the Executive Director for the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. Our next guest is very familiar to guests and members of CBTU. In fact, she spoke this morning, Ms. Petey Talley. She's the Secretary Treasurer. If this were to Apollo, I would have an attitude. Our next guest is doing us a big favor. She, at the last minute, is stepping in for someone else who has some business to tend to in Washington, D.C. So I'd like for you to give a big welcome to Nia Martin Robinson. Nia is the Director of Black Leadership and Engagement for Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund. Our final guest is another CBTU member from Canada, Mark Brown. Mark is Chair of Equity for Toronto York Region Labor Council, and he's also very good with social media. So tonight they're going to share some of their experiences with us. But first, I want each of them to just give us a little description of the kind of work they do and where they're at with that.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. Carmen Berkeley, I know some of you know her, called me yesterday morning and asked me to be here and to sit in for her. So one, to be able to sit in for her is an honor, but also just to be able to be here with all of you is incredibly exciting. So, as you heard, I'm the Director of Black Leadership and Engagement for Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Planned Parenthood Action Fund. I started that job on May the 10th, so like 2 weeks ago exactly. And it's a job that I take incredibly seriously because I understand the gravity and the necessity of really being able to think about how not just Black women, but Black people in general have access to sexual and reproductive health care in this country. So on top of all of the other things that are currently being stripped away, we are also dealing with a consistent fight around reproductive health care and reproductive rights. I come out of doing environmental work, and one of the big things that I noticed when I left the Sierra Club to come and work for Planned Parenthood was the difference between working in an issue that was under attack and then working for an organization that is like literally the face and the symbol for the issue or the movement that you're working in. So for us, very often when there are reproductive health care attacks, that attack is lodged directly at Planned Parenthood as a symbol for all of that. So after Donald Trump got in office, we knew that the ACA repeal was coming, and directly attached to that was a defund of Planned Parenthood. So we went from, crying the night of the election and probably a couple weeks after, like a lot of other folks, to really thinking about what did we do. The good thing was that we saw so many more folks who were like, we want to be supporters, we want to be volunteers, we want to support, we want to help out. And so it really galvanized and multiplied our base in a way that we hadn't been seeing. And so we were really thinking about how do we, at this time, use, what for a lot of folks was a surprise in the election, how do we use that to continue to keep people motivated in the face of fear for the next 4 years? So we did what you all do. We organized, we mobilized, we agitated that base, and we, with partners like folks in labor and the environment, fought off the ACA repeal and fought off that initial defund for Planned Parenthood. For us, the idea around the storm is continuous. I started working for Planned Parenthood in January of 2016, right at the time of when elections were heating up. And so I've asked a lot of my coworkers, when have you ever had a down period? And that isn't something that really exists for us. So we fight and exist in the storm simply because we are consistently under attack. Even when we have had times of having friendly administrations, we are dealing with fraudulent videos and folks who are trying to take us down in other ways. So we often use the storm as an opportunity to continue to base build, continue to educate, and to continue to agitate our folks around making sure that they are fighting with us on the road for reproductive freedom.
Buenas noches, CBTU.
Buenas noches.
Such an honor to always be here. I think I'm being invited to CBTU every year since I've been executive director of LACLA. I want to particularly recognize my dear brother over there in the corner, Bill Lucy, somebody that I learned so much from, and a brother that has been just such an inspiration. So thank you for everything, brother. So LACLA is the constituency group that works on everything related to Latino immigrant workers. It's the constituency group similar to CBTU, and obviously we have been collaborating for CBTU for a very long time. Again, personally starting with brother Bill Lucy, and recently with my great brother Terry Melvin, to really have honest, transparent conversations about where we are as communities of color, where we are as African Americans and Latinos and immigrants, and how do we organize to be better advocates and to better organize the workers that we represent. I'm just coming from Denver right now, and on the plane I was really reflecting on my personal journey and how in depth I am with the African American community, because an African American sister trained me on organizing. It was such a powerful experience to be able to spend so much time with her on the road. She was training African American parents, and I was training Latino parents, but I was obviously pretty young. And through her, through all the time that we had together on the road, I had the honor to understand the historical struggle, the powerful struggle of the African American community, and learn what aggressive advocacy is all about. And this sister, that at some point she was a Black Panther, make me understand that nothing is gonna be given to us, that we have to fight and get those spaces of power. So I'm so in that, and every time I see myself in a particular element of struggle or trying to take important decisions, I always try to reflect on the historical struggle of the African American community and learn through the power of organizing, through the power of fighting, through the powerful history of this beautiful community. So I just want to thank you for opening your doors and inviting me to have a nice conversation with all of you in this fantastic space.
So I want to thank you for having me. As you said before, my name is Mark Brown, and I'm from the Toronto and New York District Labor Council. I'm also a member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers for approximately the last 30 years. And one of the things that, there are postal workers in the house? I think I heard postal workers, all right. So one of the things that I do on behalf of the Toronto local is I'm the liaison between the work of the local and the work in the overall labor movement. So in my role with the Toronto and New York Region Labor Council, as co-chair of the Equity Committee, we deal with issues that affect our membership. In Toronto, 51% of the population are racialized. And a lot of the issues disproportionately affect our membership. Issues such as labor law reform. A lot of racialized people are the ones that are making the minimum wage. So that's something that we would be tackling. The rise of hate and extremism is another thing that we tackle as well at the Labor Council, as well as broader topics such as the issue of police violence and criminal justice system. So these are some of the things under that hat. What wasn't mentioned before is that when I'm not doing any of that, I'm also a journalist for the Pride News. And the Pride News is an African Caribbean newspaper in the Toronto area. And the role there is basically to connect the work that the labor movement is doing with the community that wouldn't normally hear about what we are doing. A large portion of the community still sees unions as filing grievances and aren't aware of the work that we do around issues such as domestic violence and other issues that disproportionately affect our community. Thank you.
Hello again, sisters and brothers. I'm P.D. Talley, Secretary-Treasurer of the Ohio AFL-CIO. In that capacity, I serve as one of two principal officers of the state federation that represents roughly 600,000 union members in the great state of Ohio. In my capacity as Secretary-Treasurer, I have the responsibility of being the Chief Administrative Officer, which means I'm doing HR work, I'm doing payroll work, I'm paying bills, accounting work, you name it, anything having to do with making sure that the day-to-day operations of the Federation is rolling, that is the work that I do. I'm the first woman to serve in that capacity in the 50-plus years history of the Ohio AFL-CIO. So my job is a full-time job. According to the Constitution, I have to give full time to the service of the AFL-CIO. But the Constitution also affords me the opportunity to hire staff to carry out the functions of the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO. So a lot of the work that is aligned with my responsibilities, I have staff that are able to kind of keep everything flowing, and that frees me up sometimes to kind of think about other kinds of work that needs to happen in the AFL-CIO. As you can imagine, in the Federation of Labor, there are a lot of men, and there are a lot of white men who are leaders of local unions and state district councils that are doing the work that I come into contact with all the time. And I'm sitting in the room, and oftentimes I'm the only woman. Sometimes I'm the only person of color. And so I think a lot about the responsibilities that I have as an officer of the Federation and leading all of labor. But then there's a side of me that also thinks about what is missing in this room as it relates to people of color, Black and brown people, sometimes women. And so because I have the luxury of having a staff that can help me carry out the functions of my constitutional duties, I'm also able to actually turn some focus and focus in on what is missing in terms of a full progressive agenda that we're trying to advance when we're fighting for economic justice for workers. Because the workers that we come in contact with, they're not all white, they're Black, they're brown. And so I have the opportunity to lean in and do some work through the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I also serve on the A. Fuller Randolph Institute. But even broader than that, I convene a coalition called the Ohio Unity Coalition, which affords me the opportunity to really engage with other leaders in the community, particularly in the Black community, that are trying to advance an agenda that helps out the community in many ways. And that could include faith leaders. It includes leaders of civic organizations like Masons and sororities and fraternities. And we built some really good work in Ohio that affords us an opportunity to kind of not only look through the worker lens, but also look through the lens of the community and try to figure out how we build a more progressive state in Ohio for workers and the community and the residents of Ohio.
I wanted to mention, during the course of our conversation tonight, you will receive index cards. And on those index cards, you can write a question. And those questions will be forwarded to us up here on the stage. And at some point during this conversation, we'll take some of those questions and have them answered, or addressed at least, by our panelists. So be looking out for those index cards. So if you have a question, fill those out, send them up, we'll deal with them. So the next thing I want to do, I want to kind of ask the panel, one of the questions that did come to us from among the group was, how do you go about balancing national priorities with local needs? Because a lot of cases, national organizations say, we want you to send out something locally and we want you to get your folks charged up. And you might be engaged in some work already. So how do you try to navigate the national priorities with your local work, and how do you try to get the national structures to really engage and embrace the work you're doing locally and saying that that work has value on its own, and to let you do that work and to be supported?
So I think that one of the ways to incorporate the priorities of a national agenda at the local level is to make sure we have done the work of building a very strong and effective infrastructure that is capable of being flexible, that is capable of taking in different issues that may come up. We could be working on the fight for 15, and then suddenly our voting rights are in jeopardy. In 2011 in Ohio, we were working on Senate Bill 5, an attack on public sector workers. And at the same time, here comes another threat that was coming down nationally. So I would say that I think if we have to have an infrastructure that is really capable of responding to a number of issues that are going to be facing and attacking us or coming at us at any given moment. And that means making sure that we're meeting on a regular basis, making sure that we set an agenda for ourselves that we can kind of go back to if we get pulled off on a national campaign, and being consistent about what we need to be doing on an ongoing basis so that we can, in fact, address agendas that come from the national, and sometimes they may even come from within our state. Infrastructure building is so important to do the work that we need to do. If we're trying to organize people, we have to have our house in order, have our house built, and be ready to make those responses.
Before I became the Director of Black Leadership and Engagement, I was what we call a Regional Campaign Director, and so it was my job to work with our Planned Parenthood affiliates in a number of states along the Eastern Seaboard. And so very often, we would have these huge federal fights that would come down, and it would be my job to sort of translate that to the affiliates and get their buy-in on in-state actions, talking to legislators, things like that. And so what I always attempted to do was make sure that the ask was broad enough so that in state they could fit it into the work that they were already doing. Or, for instance, if the idea was that we need to challenge legislators in Congress who voted to repeal ACA, and if I have a number of blue states and those don't exist there, then we say, well, let's turn your campaign into a thanks campaign for the folks who voted the right way, right? But it was always about giving space for them to make the issue relevant, to make it fit, and to make sure that it was something that their supporters and their volunteers on the ground were going to be able to buy into as well.
So for us, we call, when we're working on something and a major issue comes down from the national and we have to scramble, we actually call that Wednesday. That's a regular thing within the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Challenges to our rights, both at the federal and at the provincial level. But, we do have to dance, both when it affects us directly and when it doesn't affect us directly. For example, we are federally regulated workers. We deal with things on a federal issue, but things like the labor law, things like the minimum wage issue might come down as well, and we have to deal with both of them, because what we find is that what happens provincially has a reverse ripple effect federally. If the minimum wage is below the poverty line, if the provincial government are able to take certain rights away from workers, and we sit back and don't address that because we're federally, well, our contract negotiations are coming up in the future, and those are taken away as well. So we sort of have to adapt and dance. And what the sister was saying earlier about building infrastructures to get that work done, I think that that's something that is imperative, because we don't have the luxury of saying that we're too busy when we have a fight, sometimes the fight of our survival on our hands.
Very important question, especially at the times that we are confronting as communities of color, and literally the daily attacks that we are facing. I know we're very familiar with a lot of the issues that get a lot of the national and media attention, but there is so much that is at stake. Pillars of justice that took us decades to win. Sometimes they don't even make it to the news, and it's just attacks after attacks from this administration. The political moment right now makes the groundwork even more important. And a lot of the fights that we're seeing right now that are being won come from the ground. I think the national fight in a lot of cases is being totally weakened by the craziness of this person that is in the White House that literally drastically changed the game. And anti-democracy, anti-anything. I mean, in the past, regardless if we were Democrats or Republicans, we had access to the administrations to disagree or agree in many cases. Right now, that process literally changed. It's an imposition of different extremism that is affecting the daily life of our families. So right now, the groundwork is playing such a critical role, and I couldn't agree with you more, Piri. This is the time to build and put much more importance to our ground game. And a lot of the leadership right now that is coming is actually coming from the ground, from the base, from the cities, from the states. Just think about the victories that we have had in the recent times. All that vibrant element is coming from the ground. The voting rights, on wages, I mean, just look at you talk about women, Petey, look at all the women of color that are getting elected, kind of saying enough is enough and running for office and getting involved in all these elements, because at a time when we're facing all these challenges and all these attacks, our communities are taking the most important elements of democracy, and we're doing voter registration, GOTV, voter education, running for office, all different spaces. But I see that a strategic space mostly coming from the ground. Now, that doesn't mean that the national and the federal work is not important. I think we also need to make sure that we take these times of unique challenges to make sure that we get our house in order. My other role is I'm the chair, emeritus chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. It's the coalition of the 46 most important national Latino organizations, including the Hispanic Chambers of Commerce, U.S.-Mexico Chamber, so the more conservative spaces and all the different organizations that do work. It has been very, very interesting to see how united we are. In the past, the 5% of disagreements that we had in a full agenda really divided everything that we did, and it was almost impossible to take decisions. Right now, we're focusing on that 95% that we agree on and pushing together, shoulder to shoulder, holding hands and moving a Latino agenda in the same direction. So from the federal perspective and the national perspective, I think this is a unique time to really take a step back, have an honest conversations among our leadership and communities and organizations, and decide that we are going to move forward in one particular direction. Because at the time when we're facing so many attacks and challenges, the last thing that we want to do as communities of color is to look divided and to look disorganized.
Thank you. If you have filled out the index card, just hold them up, and somebody will come around and collect them. And if you haven't yet filled it out and you need a little more time, when you're done, hold them up, we'll come get them. The next question I want to pose specifically to Mark. We're used to turning on the television, radio, picking up a newspaper, and hearing about an incident of police violence against someone in our community. It's all too common, all too common. But we don't hear if this is a problem unique to the United States or not. So my question, Mark, is, are there issues of police violence in Canada, and how do they impact the Black community there? And how are you guys reacting to that? And my final question is, how can we best learn about those struggles on an ongoing basis so that we can support them?
Thank you again for that question. To answer it in a nutshell, absolutely yes. Canada has a long history of struggles around race relations with the police force. We have long lists of names of African and Black Canadians that have experienced a disproportionate violence at the hands of the police. We have issues specifically when the person is Black and suffering from mental health issues. The name Andrew Loco comes to mind. This is a young man that was having a medical episode, a mental health episode, and the police were called to the hallway of his apartment building, and within 3 minutes after they arrived, he was dead. The name Jermaine Anthony Carby comes to mind. Jermaine is also a young Black man whose death is as a result of what we call carding, which is equivalent to what you have as stop and frisk. Carding for us is basically when the police stop somebody who's not charged with a crime, not suspected of a crime, and they have a conversation. And within that conversation, identification is taken and that information is documented. It seems simple enough, but the problem is that contact leaves the individual, quote, known to police. And for those whose employment or future employment also includes a security check, well, they've just failed that check. So carding was a major issue. It was brought to the attention, brought to the forefront by many advocates over the years, by the young people, Black Lives Matter Toronto. I'll shout them out wherever I go for the good work that they've done over the years. But Jermaine Anthony Carby is dead as a result of carding. That communication led to his death. So some of the things that we've done over the years in regards to bringing attention to this situation include disrupting the norm. Young people, Black Lives Matter Toronto at one point blocked the Allen Expressway, which is a major highway in Toronto, to bring the attention, bring the attention of police violence forward. About 2 summers ago, they stepped it up a notch. They were soon joined by the labor movement, by unions from across the province, as we occupied the Metro Toronto Police Station headquarters, refused to leave, draped a banner over the front of the building that said Black Lives Matter, and we said we're not going until we're going to get some change. And, you know, sometimes that is simply what's needed. I know that we're trade union people, so we like to put together a committee and have a meeting and decide how we're going to do this and debate and go back and forward. But that action was put together in about 15 minutes after a demo. I watched those young people say, well, what are we going to do next? Let's occupy the police station. Out of that came a series of events that changed the course of history in Toronto. It's not perfect yet, but the premier at that time, Kathleen Wynne, left the legislature and came and met with those young people and had a talk with them and committed to changing the rules around the Special Investigation Unit. This is the department that investigates cases of police brutality as a result of what they did. And now we've received, they have not eliminated carding, which is something that the community has been calling for. What they've done is they've regulated carding, which we're seeing as a how-to list on how to continue to do more of the same. So the struggle is not over. The list of African Canadians that are negatively affected by police, negatively and disproportionately affected by police violence continues to grow. But the community organizations, along with labor, along with the Ontario Federation of Labor, along with the Toronto Labor Council, and of course along with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, we continue to move forward with that struggle until the day that we don't see this problem anymore. And just before I end, I want to make it clear, I'm speaking about black people going through this situation. But once you go further north, it's the same story with an indigenous face attached to it. It's the same disproportionate violence. And when you add to the equation a mental health issue, we have a problem. And it's a problem around de-escalation. But it's a problem that labor and community are tackling together and continue to fight together.
So I was listening to Mark and also thinking too about something that PD said, as we're sort of seeing this rise of Black women in movement, I think the great thing that we're also seeing in the U.S. as it relates to, not great, but a point that we're seeing, especially as it relates to police brutality, is that it isn't a gendered issue, right? So the death of Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, Sandra Bland in Texas, and then what just happened to Chiquisha Clemens in Alabama is really showing us that as we are talking about police brutality, we can't continue to gender the issue either, right? We can't talk about it as if the attacks against Black folks that come from the police are only happening to Black men or to Black male bodies. And I think that having folks in power at Black Lives Matter, like Patrisse Cullors, like Alicia Garza, is really helping to elevate and helping us to remember to say the names of Black women that are also being attacked. So I think leadership, one, gives visibility for other Black women, gives opportunity for us to all be able to continue to do the work, but also gives opportunity for us to talk about the tragedy that's happening to Black women as well.
I would add from the United States side of things as well. I think in the labor movement, I think that was a great example that you indicated in terms of how labor kind of came together really quickly and got involved in the issue. And we have some unfinished business, I think, in the United States labor movement. Following the very tragic death of Michael Brown, the AFL-CIO put together the Racial and Economic Justice Commission. And I think during that work, we went around the country, we had a lot of hearings about how we could be more responsive. And since that time, there have been a number of people who have died, number of Black men who have still met their death. And I think that we, on the United States side, have to be more visible. We have to show up more in the community when these things are happening, because our voice can really lend some credibility to some solutions that could come forward. We had a number of recommendations come forward through the Racial and Economic Justice Commission work that was started by the AFL-CIO, but we need to be doing a whole lot more in terms of how we're addressing these kinds of things showing up in the community.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and I'll try to frame it like this for the panel to deal with. We see that there is a growing anti-worker movement in the judicial system. We already know that the Supreme Court is stacked in favor of Trump and right-wing ideologues. And this morning, President Melvin, I think, did a great job of outlining that this is just not at that level. It's all the way through the system. And there are cases now pending before the Supreme Court that will have a profound impact on workers. The Jonas versus AFSCME case is one. Just the other day, the court ruled that employees do not have the right to file class action suits and that they have to pursue arbitration in cases which essentially means you're on your own. That basically is what it means. And the employer now has the upper hand. So the question generally is, how should unions and allies begin to develop strategies to protect workers in this kind of environment of judicial assault? Anybody?
So I can speak a little bit on the Canadian experience that we had under the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He passed, or attempted to pass, legislation, I believe it was Bill 525, that would require unions to divulge publicly their financial situation. And the rationale or the end result of that would be that when you're going into bargaining with the employer, The employer knows your situation, but you don't know theirs. At the time, there was a series of different anti-worker bills that he was trying to get through, and it was very clear that his overall goal was to decimate the trade union movement. But, you know, we have a saying, we say that one of the best organizers of workers is the management, because when the management collectively kicks the workers come together. And in this situation, the labor movement, the various unions came together like at no other time in history that I've seen before. Campaigning, going door to door into the streets to make sure that Prime Minister Harper did not get re-elected anywhere in the country. At the same time, while he was doing that, we had a premier, which is the same as your governor, is my understanding, Tim Hudak, who took the position that he was going to create jobs by putting 100,000 public sector workers out of work. And it was the labor movement that came together and campaigned and knocked on doors and went to communities within their riding. And when all the smoke cleared, Tim Hudak is no longer in office, and Stephen Harper is no longer in office either. And gone with them are those bills and agendas. A lot of these issues, a lot of the positions, as we see it, that they take are tied to the ballot box. But that's our power. Organizing and speaking to the community, that's something that labor does and continues to do and continues to do it well. And I think it has an impact going forward on how these things pan out.
Next question we have, and the question is, with the continued attacks on unions, how can we change the direction to increase membership of constituent organizations? Let me just say something here, because I think it's important that we push back a little bit against the narrative that unions are going down the tubes. Last year, more than 250,000 workers joined unions. It's a story you do not hear. You do not hear that story. In fact, last month, in 1 week, more than 10,000 people joined unions. And they're coming from all different sectors, from attendants who work for JetBlue, to grad students at Harvard University, to people working in the nursing field. But what is happening is that the Trump phenomenon has sucked the oxygen out of the media and their attention span. They never were really that interested in what was going on with unions if it were a positive story anyway. The Trump phenomenon has now just given them an excuse to just say, we don't even know what's happening. So part of what we have to do for our own self-health is when we get stories and information that are facts, not fake news, but facts, that the union movement is fighting back and it's winning. And why are we winning? Because the need is there. People understand that they cannot improve their situation, the low wages, the lack of promotions, the poor working conditions, the bad schedules, if they just keep talking individually. So they are banding together and they're standing up. Newsrooms, workers in newsrooms are organizing. So what you're seeing now is that the tide is on our side, even though there are forces coming at us to push us back. But we need to tell the stories of our victories, because it gives people hope. It lets people know that if they're in a situation and isolated, that it still is possible. It's still possible to fight and win. So we need to recognize the threats, but we also need to claim our victories. So, on that, the next, go ahead.
I completely agree with you. One of the most powerful things that we do at Planned Parenthood is to go into the health centers, and we have a program called the Patient Advocacy Program. Because for us, it's not just about the supporters and volunteers and people who love Planned Parenthood talking about it. It's about the people who actually, on a day-to-day basis, receive those services. And so for instance, we have a young woman born and raised in West Virginia. She's a black woman, a single mother, was an Army vet, a survivor of domestic violence, and a survivor of sexual assault that she received at the hands of fellow Army men, right? And she, before she would even step foot into a Veterans Affairs hospital, she comes to Planned Parenthood, drives an hour to her Planned Parenthood to be able to receive the care because she knows that that's the place that's going to take care of her. I could tell Peshka's story all day, but when we figure out a way for Peshka to be on TV, to be on social media, and to be uplifting her own story, she completely changed the game. And in a state like West Virginia, we had Senator Joe Manchin, who would never even get close to Planned Parenthood, stand up in front of a room full of people and say that he supported Planned Parenthood, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that he had met Peshka Calloway, heard her story, and was able to hear about the impact that Planned Parenthood had in the state of West Virginia.
Our next question from the audience, someone would like for somebody on the panel to address the question of immigration status, which is being added to the 2020 census, and they feel that this is illegal and is disenfranchising our communities. So, Hector, what do you think?
Thank you. No, it's a very strategic and important question because these guys are coming from every angle and every direction. Literally, we have three branches of government that are anti-minorities and anti-workers. And they're really manipulating the system in the best possible way that they can just to remove power from our communities. And this question of the census is so important. The census is so important, and sometimes it doesn't get a lot of national attention. If you add a citizenship question to the census at a time when we're facing so many attacks, at a time when Latinos in general are facing so many challenges, hate crimes, bullying, racial profiling, and all kinds of attacks against Latinos drastic increase since this president started running for office. All the language that he has been using is having a deep impact in our communities. I hear it every day in the office. Just some of the most visible cases that we have seen, a lawyer in Manhattan, literally attacking, and this is in video, a lady for ordering her salad in Spanish. In Montana, a lady, a US citizen, was talking to her daughter in Spanish. And they called the Border Patrol, and the Border Patrol was the Border Patrol heard the lady talking Spanish. And I don't want to go through the whole stories because this is happening all over the nation. We are living in a space of terrorizing the immigrant community, which is not the immigrant community, it's the Latino community overall. What does it mean when you add this question to the census? Obviously, it's going to exclude entire communities from participating in the census. And what does it mean when you don't participate in the census? That means political power, that affects redistricting, that affects the funding that goes to our schools. Remember, our communities, we are mostly, when I say we, minorities, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, we're mostly working class communities. We live in the same area. So all this really affects the quality of life of our entire families. We're strongly pushing against this situation. It's already pretty hard when it comes to the census and making sure this is constitutionally mandated that every person in the nation has to be counted for many reasons. And it goes to so many issues. It goes to research, it goes to spending, it goes to decision-making process, it goes to the political sphere. It's becoming just such a difficult times for our communities. And it's important, brothers and sisters, it's important that at this time we stay united. I know there have been some cases and some instances on the ground that are trying to put black and brown against each other, that are saying we are stealing each other's jobs, that we are stealing each other's services, that we are literally, they took one or two local situations. That happened in every community. There was a violence between an African American and Latino, or between a Latino and African American, and they sensationalize these issues, making it sound like we are communities that are literally against each other. If I present to you right now my usual PowerPoint presentation on Latino workers, and I just changed Latino for African American, you wouldn't even realize it because the numbers are so close on the challenges that we're facing. Death and injuries at work, wage theft. I mean, I can go on and on all the different labor issues. We're facing similar challenges, almost the same challenges. We're almost 35% of the population in the nation together, 35. And if we look into other challenges that we're facing, criminal justice issues, black and brown people are mostly us, the ones that are being fully targeted to just fill up these jails. If you look at economic empowerment, if you look at so many issues, this is the time to really take a step back together. And I know we've been trying for a number of years. This is the time to really be strategic, be honest, and find ways to collaborate. I want to recognize our dear brother Terry Melvin, because he has been a fantastic leader for LCCA, which is the coalition of all the constituency groups, and we elected Terry to be our leader, and he has really taken the coalition to a level of unity and just sophistication of advocacy. We're very, very united. And through these different spaces, we need to find common grounds. I know CBTU and LACLA, or boards before, we had spaces working together. For me personally, one of the most beautiful moments in the fight against immigration was in the conference of CBTU in Phoenix. It was the biggest anti-Latino legislation, SB 1070, literally legalizing racial profiling. And I never heard speakers speaking so profoundly with so much power. As African-American leaders really standing in solidarity with immigrants, it was so powerful and so unique, and we need to continue moving those spaces of solidarity and unity forward to make sure that we really represent that 35% of communities that we together represent in the nation.
I think a great example of that is what happened Tuesday in Georgia. So I think we saw two historic things in Georgia on Tuesday. One, Stacey Abrams mollywopped the other Stacey. I can't even remember her last name at this point, right? In the primary for the Democratic governor's race. And an organization called Mi Gente said, you know what, we are going to tackle anti-blackness in the Latino community, and we are going to rally Latinos in Georgia to elect Stacey Abrams, to get her past this primary and to get her into the governor's mansion in November. And I feel like those are the kinds of conversations we need to be having and looking at as a case study for how we can work together, also understanding that some Latinos look like me, right? So how are we talking about what it means to be a diasporic people, and then that being Latino doesn't necessarily mean that you also aren't a black person.
That leads directly to the next question that came from the audience, and it goes to PD first, but I'd like to hear some other folks deal with it. PD, you worked in Virginia in 2017 on the governor's race and some of the other races, and a Democrat, Northam, pulled off the victory there and gave the Democrats a much, much needed victory. But the truth wasn't really told in the media about how that happened. So the question from the audience is, do you think the kind of aggressive campaign that you were part of in Virginia needs to happen across the country? And will the Democratic Party, and this echoes something that President Melvin raised today, will the party really wake up and lean into its base and do what's necessary to motivate us, to provide the resources, and to allow us to empower us with candidates and strategy to win in November?
I get that question, huh? Yeah, so we did, in fact, end up doing some really good work. The Coalition of Black Trade Unionists ran a voter empowerment initiative called We Rise Virginia. And we began having some conversations. We worked in collaboration with the NAACP about how we could go after a base of infrequent voters. These are mainly black voters who really don't get touched by the political parties because of their status of being an infrequent voter. Because if you want to win, you want to turn out people that are likely voters, not necessarily infrequent voters. But we were able to identify a number of those voters and go out and do the heavy lifting that it took to get that work done. To your question as to whether or not the Democratic Party will, or political parties will ever appreciate the contributions that we can make in elections, I certainly hope so. 2016 should have been a wake-up call for the party in terms of how it recruits candidates to run for office and how those candidates can connect with the voters that are necessary to get them to win. If people are unengaged and people are unenthused about going out and voting, they simply won't do it. And so part of the work that we did in Virginia was to make sure people understood Ralph Northam's record, what he would do to the voters of Virginia, what he was standing on. It kind of helped that Justin Fairfax was running and happened to be a person of color, an African American, who won the lieutenant governor spot, even though there were some issues as to whether or not both of their pictures appeared on certain literature. These are the kinds of things that we have to be ready to be mobilized, and we have to mobilize against just to make sure that our community understands what's at stake. These midterm elections, sisters and brothers, are critical. It is critical for us to be there. 2016 seems like it was an anomaly, but now there's some strategy conversations taking place as to whether or not we should, in fact, engage the base vote, which is where we find ourselves in the party structure, or should we go after the Trump switchers? And I will tell you a story about in Ohio. We've kind of really did the research, and we found out some really troubling news, right? We found out that of the Trump switchers, and those are people who voted twice for President Obama in 2008 and 2012, but switched their vote to Donald Trump in 2016, in the state of Ohio, 39% of union households were found to be in that category, right? And that's just union, right, where it was probably a lot worse among non-union households, right, in terms of the people that switch. So we have to make sure that we're firming up the base. We have to make sure that we are firming up the base of voters who give their vote to the party, to the Democrat candidate, 90% of the time, in order to get the win. But we also should hold the Democratic Party responsible for making sure that that community is engaged sooner rather than later, not wait until the last minute to try to come into our community and have a political conversation when they should be having a conversation about the issues that are at stake in the election. We have to make sure that the party is seeking out good candidates that we can actually put our support behind, because that is going to be critical. I think the sister alluded to The shellacking that Stacey Abrams gave her opponent, I mean, that's a clear indication that if we organize and we mobilize and we make sure that voters in the community understand who's the better candidate, who has their interests, and we get out there and do the work, and we get out there and do the work soon, that we could actually win. And looking at that political map in Georgia, to see Stacey Abrams win all of those counties except 4, that's pretty remarkable, because y'all know black folks don't live in all those counties, right? So we got to organize across racial lines, across gender lines, across all kinds of lines to make sure that we are sending a message that we want to see ourselves reflected in our democracy, and that includes in the voting booth as well as those that are running for office.
How effective do we have to be at going at state democratic organizations? Because it seems to me that the mobilization is local. But are the state parties more in control of resources, messaging, candidate recruitment than the national party? Because we need to figure out, where do we aim our fire?
Okay, so I think that there are a number of places that we got to aim for, right? So it is state parties, it's national parties, but there's this new thing that has emerged called independent expenditures, right? Who have a boatload of money. They put money into campaigns. It is not reportable. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know who's behind it. And there's a lot of money being spent in elections funding up campaigns that are independent from the party and independent from the candidate. Now, there are good independent PACs, and there are bad, not so good independent PACs. The good ones aim to look to expand the electorate and make sure that the voices of all of the people are included. That could make the difference in the outcome of the elections. The bad ones, not so much. They spend their money on air, running really terrible commercials that the voters actually get sick of before it's time for an election. If we can identify and tap into those good independent expenditures that will use their money, that are willing to put money into mobilization of voters, whether they're brown voters, black voters, young voters, single women voters, wherever that we can build that progressive coalition like President Obama did, we can, in fact, take advantage of those resources and move away from the party that sometimes may not even have the resources that they need to even operate and do their programs. We get left off the radar screen because there may not be enough money in the parties. We need to start looking a little bit more broader and look at ways that we can tap into independent expenditure activity so that we can advance a very effective mobilization structure.
Hector and Nina.
Thank you, Petey, for putting it in that context. We keep talking about elections, but in very few occasions. We talk elections on Latinos and blacks and minorities, but very few people really take the time to do an in-depth analysis connecting those expectations with money. We did that. And it's embarrassing to see the lack of money being invested in Latino civic participation. When I say an embarrassment, I put together the Latino civic engagement table, and I told all the organizations, the most important Latino organizations, come on, we're family. Let's be transparent about the money that we have for a presidential election. And I can tell you it wasn't even 10 million at a time when the presidential election, the progressive side spent 2 billion, okay? So now, let's translate that into the labor movement, because it seems like we are obsessed spending most of our money with the white unionists that voted for Trump. Why is most of the money going for that particular issue? I'm not saying it's not important, but we're missing an opportunity. Democracy is extremely expensive. Democracy is extremely expensive. And I know people think that just because we're under attack, we're going to come out in drastic numbers. That's not the reality of how the democratic process works. We know, and research shows, that when we invest in spaces, when we invest in different communities, people come and vote. When we invest in doing voter registration, when we invest in doing GOTV and voter education, we have results. But in our communities, we are expected just to make it happen just because we are under attack. And that shouldn't be the case. We must be together putting internal pressure in our unions, and I know all of us come from different unions, and I will challenge all of the unions in all the different spaces that are investing political money just to really see how much they're putting to do voter registration for blacks and Latinos, or how much are they doing to invest in all these different efforts. Because I can tell you, we had these conversations, they just expect us to come out as constituency groups and do all these efforts that are a particular price point for a voter registration for all these, but they just expect us to do this with no money, and that shouldn't be the case.
Consistently, right. Consistently, our communities are taken for granted. So not just Virginia in 2017, but Alabama, black women in those areas, the most consistent voting bloc, and there isn't the kind of investment that needs to be made in those communities, because it is just like, oh, well, they'll show up, they'll come. And so what's happening this year at Planned Parenthood, Center for Community Change, Color of Change PAC, and SEIU, we're doing something called the Win Justice Project, where we're investing $30 million in Florida, Nevada, and Michigan to turn out not those likely voters, but to turn out 2.5 million unlikely voters, young folks, young women, and people of color constituencies, to really be able to start to say, how do we change the universes that we're building as we're thinking about doing our electoral work? So we say we want 2.5 million unlikely voters that turn into funnel into being 200,000 supporters and participants into activities that we're doing. But they're really this project is amazing because it's really thinking about how we are activating a new base and not just waiting until GOTV to be having these conversations with folks about getting out to vote, but making a considerable financial investment and a considerable time investment in key states where we need to be turning out votes of folks who have not been turned out, not because they don't care, but because we aren't making an effort to invest in their civic participation.
I want to pose a question to Mark, because last year, I believe it was last year, we had a brother from Canada who had been elected to an office, and he spoke very eloquent guy. And we've also had a number of Canadian office holders here, people of color. So my question is, how do you guys deal with the issue of getting more visibility within your labor structures to do your politics? And do you have to struggle to get resources to do mobilization in your communities?
So, for us, when there's an issue that we need to mobilize, generally the first conversation, or one of the first conversations, takes place within the labor movement. And I'm sure similar conversations take place within community organizations. But I've seen where we've collectively been under attack, and it's the labor movement that comes together and the different unions that buy in on a strategy to move forward. I gave an example earlier about Stephen Harper. Well, one of the reasons why he wasn't in power was because unions got together and we agreed on a strategy that included literally taking out billboard ads, putting them on the side of buses in the riding, and sending those buses around, informing the voters as to the decisions that that particular MP was making. Needless to say, they weren't very happy about it, seeing their faces across the various buses. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a cohesion in the movement. When there's a cause like that that affects our members, that affects everybody. I find that we get further ahead when we do that together. There's always challenges to try and stop us from doing that. Right now, we have an election law that has come into place that severely handcuffs the work that unions can do in regards to elections. But they're not going to stop workers from doing what workers need to do, because the issues affect those workers, affect the membership. So the point that I'm trying to make is that when these things happen, it's the labor movement that often comes together and comes up with sometimes creative ways of getting the message out to make the changes that need to be made.
We have a question that came from a union steward in the audience, Billy Williams. And his question kind of goes back to some of the remarks you made, Hector. And his question is this: working in the food service industry, which has a large number of Latino workers who enjoy relative job security and upward mobility in their lifestyles, have become somewhat complacent in their social activism. These same people now fear they or their children will be deported due to the policies of the current administration. How do we get these workers to stand up with their black, white, brown, and Asian brothers and sisters and fight for their rights and not hide?
Yeah, such an important question. When they ask me, and they ask us, if immigrants are stealing jobs from different communities, we need to be very careful about the way we respond and we analyze. I know that under the current situation in the nation and so much stress in the communities, so much concentration of wealth, that is going to continue, by the way, with the tax reform that just passed that is missing a lot of attention. It's such a historical important issue, because if right now we have 3 people that has the same money as 150 million people, with that tax reform that affected the progressive tax, it's just going to continue in that direction and affecting the middle class. I say this because these struggles in really the working class community, the ones that earn a minimum wage and immigrants less, is going to continue a manipulation of this messaging, and we need to be extremely careful. I think we need to do better job organizing those workers, bringing those workers on board with the different issues. I have traveled all over the nation witnessing the conditions of immigrant workers in the nation, and nobody should work under those conditions. There are entire bubbles of exploitation that nobody sees in the nation. Bubbles that are not in the media, bubbles of exploitation that are hidden. When we see the conditions of farm workers in the nation that are dying for pesticides exposure, when we see the drastic increase on sexual harassment and rape in the workplace against our immigrant sisters, at this time is unacceptable. When we see the food industry and all the continued abuse and situations, it's really increasing the vulnerability of these workers. And I always take it back to say, who's benefiting from this system? I can guarantee you not those workers. Okay? Who benefits from having 11 million undocumented workers in the most powerful nation in the world? First of all, how do we explain that we have 11 million undocumented workers in the nation? We have the biggest army in the world. We have the most advanced technology. We have everything in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. But there are forces in the nation that benefit by having 11 million undocumented brothers and sisters that create a perfect system of exploitation. Because when you add that to these enforcement-only policies, all this deportation machine, all this constant terrorizing of the communities, and these people are so desperate, and their stories are so powerful. They just want to give an opportunity to their children, maybe to have a better quality of life. And they take everything. We have a Trabajadoras campaign, which Trabajadoras mean working class women. that is particularly focused on Latina immigrants. And it's just, the stories are just devastating. And it's an embarrassment that as a nation, we have entire sectors that are going through this situation. It's stories that are so devastating, but that are so constant, that are happening all over the nation. We have stories of a sister who decided to share her own story, an immigrant single mother of two that was being raped in the Florida fields for 2 years by the supervisor. She was undocumented and she was so vulnerable that she knew that the supervisor threatened her with calling immigration. Again, this is just one story, but a story that is reflective of entire sectors of the economy that are really taking advantage of these workers. And in many cases, we're falling for this rhetoric in the nation. This president in particular has been just dehumanizing. He literally says, these people are animals. These people are animals. And he started his campaign by really, and there are sectors in the nation, even some progressive sectors, by the way, that off the record are falling into this rhetoric. We cannot fall into this rhetoric, brothers and sisters. These are human beings. And this is a systemic approach that is taking advantage of these people. And there are entire sectors of the economy that are benefiting from these people because the productivity in those industries that are represented keep increasing. They keep keeping those profits to themselves and they're not sharing it with workers. We know the story. So the answer, I think, really is organize these workers. There are in some unions, I see UFCW over here that is been doing a fantastic job really investing and organizing and bringing those workers on board. I have seen beautiful examples of solidarity when those workers are organized. Like every vulnerable worker, we know what happens when we organize and we educate these workers, and when workers know what are their rights and what are they elevated. So I just say, let's give an opportunity and organize these brothers and sisters. Let's see them as humans, and let's stop treating them as animals.
And also, too, when we claim the term ally, I think part of allyship is also being able to be understanding that for undocumented folks who are thinking about organizing, it's not just the difference between like having a job one day and not having a job the next day. It's like literally being stripped from the hands of your children in front of their school because ICE is taking you away from them. So how are we also thinking about being empathetic and understanding and meeting folks where they are and not just having demands based on what our own agendas are?
A question came from the audience dealing with what should we be doing to help formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters get jobs and avoid going back into the system. I want to reframe that a little bit in the context of our discussion of civic engagement. What should we be doing? What should we be doing to engage with formerly incarcerated sisters and brothers, not only to help them get jobs, find housing, reconnect, but also in this political cycle, how do we help them exercise their voting rights?
So earlier today in session, we heard a wonderful conversation about a program called STEEP. The brother from Detroit talked about he talked about a program that he's running in that city that is helping young black men get ready for work, breaking down barriers, I think is what he talked about. I think there are a number of programs out there in those communities that are like that target young black men, they target formerly incarcerated, they target a whole host of folks. So I think as CBTU chapters, it certainly would be fitting in our civic engagement work that we connect up with those kinds of programs that are running in our communities that can really help steer people toward employment so that they can take care of themselves and that they can take care of their families. When we look around, people are really hurting. I just really appreciated the brother's honesty in terms of what he was doing in the community, but more importantly, that he was once the target of the program that he's talking about that he's running. So there are a number of initiatives that CBTU can connect with and should be connecting with, especially given that we are a coalition of black trade unionists, that it is inferred that we are all gainfully employed somewhere. And so we should be absolutely looking at opportunities in the community that we can connect with and enhance our civic engagement work so that we are actually doing this work on a year-round basis. Once we connect, I think, with people where they are, meet them where they are, and try to help create opportunity where there appears to be none, I think we position ourselves as allies then and credible voices then that can go back to those same folks and say to those folks, look, in Ohio, in every law, every state is different as it relates to formerly incarcerated. In Ohio, you don't lose your franchise forever. Once you are out of the penal system and you're back on the street again, you can re-register and you can cast a vote. And so once we establish ourselves as credible messengers, credible helpers of the whole man, I think it's not hard to imagine that we could then go back to those same people and invite them to become part of our mobilization program and our political program when it is time to go vote. Each state is a little different. The laws are a little different here. I know they have a campaign going on right here in Florida to restore the rights of formerly incarcerated who have lost their voting rights forever. Good luck to the Floridians in that campaign this November, that they will be successful in doing that, because that then can have a domino effect. But look at what your laws are in your state, and if folks can, when they're out of prison, if they can come back and be re-registered to vote, let's do the work of helping them to find employment and then try to get them mobilized to the ballot box.
I want to ask the question, because a lot of emphasis is put on, particularly in institutions, organizations like labor, the church, and other places. We got to get the youth out. We got to do more to get young folks involved. And I hear that. I hear that. My question is, how do we develop intergenerational strategies for engaging our communities? Because we don't want to send a message to people that some are valued more now than others. Because we know that there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience, a lot of hard lessons learned that folks need to learn about. So in doing this civic engagement thing, how do we avoid the impression that we're talking to some folks, but not other folks?
I think that sometimes, I don't think that it's saying that some people are more necessary than others, but I do think that sometimes we have to put more focus on other folks, put a deeper investment in other demographics than some, because some are already represented, right? So if we're looking into a space where we don't see a lot of young people, then there may need to be a different kind of investment around making sure that young people are brought to the table, are valued, and are seen. I think that, and so to build intergenerational space for me means that there's a mutual amount of respect. When I was a young organizer, I can't tell you how many times someone older than me said, well, we've already tried that. We already tried to do that. Or we've already been there. And I got shut down very often because there wasn't respect for me as a young person. And so there has to be an opportunity for us to be able to engage in dialogue, one, to respect the folks who are coming before us, whose shoulders that we stand on, but also for older folks and for elders to be able to say, young people are experiencing the world in ways that we did not. And because they are experiencing the world in that way, they have an opportunity to speak from their lived experience that we don't understand. Like we may not be experiencing racism in the same way that folks did with the Klan, but we have a president who is existing and who is spewing hatred in ways that even like some of my parents are talking about not even seeing before, right? So all of it is not just about who's more important. It's like we just had the conversation about elections and saying we have to invest in communities that we haven't been investing in. We just said it about that. I think the same thing goes for young people, and none of that is about putting folks out to pasture. My dad grew up in Mississippi, went to segregated high schools. I talk to my father every single day because for me it's important to be able to get some perspective on what his life was like. But he also says to me, you work at Planned Parenthood, you're a black woman, you work at Planned Parenthood under the Trump administration. I can't even, a man spit on me on an airplane in 2016. And my father says, I can't imagine what that feels like to know that someone has died for you, to come this far, to sit on an airplane in first class and be spat on, right? So my father and I have this intergenerational dialogue, but it's one of respect. I understand that there are things that he's experienced that I never will, but he also understands the same thing for me, and that to me is the important part.
Excellent. I'm getting ready to ask the question that some of y'all might want to leave the room. You might want to leave the room because the discussion could just get a bit too hot. It just might divide the room. Just might make Reverend Melvin get up here and shut this thing down. It just might do that. But I'm going to risk it because somebody wanted this question asked. Again, as you said this morning, I'm just the messenger. It ain't me asking this. I'm interested in the answer, but I'm just asking the question. And the question is this: is it possible for black people to create our own party and lead the Democratic Party? Handle it. Somebody. See, brothers are leaving right. Say something. I mean, anybody?
I mean, it's not without possibility. There is some history. The Black Panther Party of the 1950s and 60s, right? I mean, it got shut down, but I mean, they were moving in that direction, right? I think that we have to make sure that we are understanding that if we are being taken for granted, and if sitting home is not an option, that we have to do something for ourselves. Essence did a poll in 2016, and the majority of women that took the poll were not satisfied with either party. And with black women, showing up and showing out the way we are, it is not necessarily without possibility that those kinds of conversations could be taking place, right? I'm not saying we're there yet, but it's not without possibility, because at some point, the political systems that we are operating under, if both party Republicans attack us, Democrats take us for granted, at some point we have to just look at what is in our own best interest. And a number of people in the state of Ohio during the governor's race of 2014 When we looked at the exit polling after that race, John Kasich, y'all remember him, ran for president, right? In 2014, he first elected in 2010. By the time it got to 2014, he had moderated somewhat. This guy, when he ran for re-election as governor, received 26% of the share of the black vote. Completely unheard of. That is double our representation in the population in the state of Ohio. So I'm just saying, folks are looking for choices in terms of where they go and where they, who they support for the issues that they believe in.
Let me ask this question, because I've thought about this for a number of cycles. If it's not strategic to leave the party, quote unquote, leave the party, is it possible for us to fund our own politics?
We got enough money. I mean,
but I'm just saying, for some reason, we got millionaires, some billionaires, some invested woke people, but we don't have PACs or whatever they would be called, where money can go into, where Stacey Abrams can say, look, sister, we're going to write you that big, big check. Why do you think it is that we have not yet developed the financial capacity to fund our own?
I will say again, black women are doing that. Right. I am on the board of a PAC that is founded by black women.
Share it.
It's called Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote. It comes out of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, Black Women's Roundtable. And we began to say, look, we have got to be in a position to fund our own politics. And so we took the step of establishing a political action committee whereby we can raise money and look at candidates and support candidates that, women candidates, at least for now, that need an opportunity that they're not getting from either of the parties, either of the political parties. And so, yeah, we have moved into that space. It's very new, but we've made the move.
Good.
There's the PAC that Petey just mentioned. There is there's Black PAC.
Yeah.
There's Color of Change PAC. So there's may not be as many as other folks do have, but our folks are thinking about how we are funding this work and building our electoral power.
Good. Please share that information so folks leave here knowing if they feel inclined to help a sister or a brother somewhere. Then they got a few dollars, they can put it in the right direction.
Yes. And can I say one more thing? Sure. I think too that continuing to tell the story of the Obama campaign and the way that like people's grannies were given $5 every now and then to that campaign, and how real grassroots fundraising worked, I think helps to shift the idea around political fundraising. We don't have to be millionaires. I gave Stacey Abrams money. You know, I don't have a whole lot of money, but I said, okay, well, this is a check that I can write. And I talked to my friends about doing the same thing. So we also have to be a part of shifting this narrative that only millionaires are giving money for electoral work, because that is also not true.
After that question, here's a softball to the panel. And it goes back to where we started. Organizing through the storm. What would you like to be working on in January of 2019 in terms of civic engagement? All of you.
So, in January of 2019, I have no problem saying that I would like to see a universal pharmacare plan covering every single Canadian right across the country. There's a lot of seniors, not just seniors, but there are too many people that have to decide between their medication and paying their rent, their medication and eating. And in a country that can contribute to sending people to the moon, that can pay countless dollars for security, we should not have the most vulnerable among us deciding between their food and their medication. To me, that's something that needs to be behind us. And it needs to be behind us before 2019, but it needs to be gone.
Oh, deep question. I know we talk a lot about all the challenges, but challenges represent unique opportunities. And I travel all over the nation, and it has been amazing. And I honestly say that I see an element of difference and how people reach out and say, what else can I do? What else? How can I engage? And like I said at the beginning, I honestly believe that all the powerful elements of democracy are going to be, in one way or another, move to another level. We have seen awesome spaces of civic participation, being marches, being mobilizations, being people of color running for office. I'm sure historical numbers in 2018 coming out to vote in a particular way. And this presidential is a unique opportunity to send a clear message that this is unacceptable, that Trump is an international embarrassment for democracy, that Trump really represents the worst that democracy can bring, but it's important to empower the democratic institutions to make sure that our great democracy moves on in a much better way and is stronger. So I'm really very hopeful to see that, and obviously all of us are part of making it happen.
I would like in January of 2019, I would like to be working on, with the campaign of some very great progressive candidate who has announced his candidacy for presidency of the United States, that is viable, that has the resources, that has the right message for this country, that will get us out of the mess that we find ourselves in, and I will lend my support to that campaign starting in January 2019 all the way through 2020.
With my job, I get the amazing opportunity to really center my work on the constituency of people who really are my people, who are the people I feel like I'm a part of. I get to work in service of Black women and girls. And that, to me, it's a beautiful thing. And so in January of 2019, I want to be still riding the wave of the excitement of us whooping tail all through the midterm elections, and taking that political power and making sure that Black women and girls, whether we're looking at the federal level or the state level, have the political power necessary to fight for the policies that will allow them to live lives of dignity and health, that they allow them to have autonomy to their own bodies, to enjoy their own bodies, and to exist in a world where they matter and where they are shown that they matter by everyone who they are encountering on a regular basis.
Thank you. Well, this is the end of this evening, but I want to thank everybody for sharing. Great questions. And I'd like to thank our panel, Petey, Mark, Hector, Nia. And I hope that we leave here understanding that what we're trying to get through here is that there are going to be storms. There are going to be things that rock us this way and that way. But the task of the warriors in the struggle is to hold firm, to be the compass. When people want to go here and go there, you have to remind them what we've invested in this particular struggle we're engaged in. To stay the course. When the resources aren't there, to hold on, to go find them. Because organizing is serious work. And organizing through the storm is even harder. Thank you.